The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Palazzo dei Congressi as Elena Marchetti adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and reviewed the quarterly reports one final time. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another mid-level analyst at the European Central Banking Authority, someone who processed numbers and filed reports without drawing attention to herself. The truth was far more complex. Elena had spent the last 18 months carefully positioning herself within the Banking Authority's research division, not for the modest salary or the bureaucratic prestige, but because this role provided her with something infinitely more valuable: access to information that could topple governments and reshape entire economies. She understood that in the modern world, power didn't flow from the barrel of a gun or the edge of a sword, but through the careful manipulation of data, influence, and human psychology. Her colleagues knew her as quiet, methodical, perhaps a bit boring. She arrived precisely at 8:30 each morning, took lunch alone while reading economic journals, and left promptly at 6. What they didn't know was that Elena had graduated summa cum laude from the London School of Economics before completing advanced studies in behavioral psychology at Cambridge. She spoke 7 languages fluently, had traveled to 43 countries, and possessed an eidetic memory that allowed her to recall conversations, documents, and financial figures with perfect accuracy years after first encountering them. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. 3 years earlier, Elena had been working as a junior researcher at a prestigious consulting firm in Milan, genuinely believing that hard work and intellectual merit would naturally lead to advancement and recognition. She had been naive then, trusting in the fairness of systems and the good intentions of those in positions of authority. That naive version of herself died on a Thursday afternoon in September when she discovered that her research on emerging market currencies had been stolen by her supervisor, Marcus Hendricks, who presented her findings as his own work to the firm's senior partners. Elena had brought her concerns to human resources, armed with time-stamped documents and email chains that clearly demonstrated her authorship of the research. She had been patient, professional, and thorough in presenting her case. The response had been swift and devastating. Marcus, who happened to be the nephew of one of the firm's founding partners, received a promotion and a corner office. Elena received a formal reprimand for making unfounded accusations against a senior colleague and found herself transferred to a windowless basement office where she processed expense reports and travel reimbursements. The betrayal had cut deep, not just because of the stolen work, but because of how easily the system had protected the connected while discarding the competent. Elena spent 3 sleepless weeks replaying the events, analyzing where she had gone wrong, and gradually coming to understand that she had been playing by rules that didn't actually exist. The real rules of advancement had nothing to do with merit and everything to do with understanding power, leverage, and the careful cultivation of useful relationships. She began studying the senior partners, not their public personas or official biographies, but their actual patterns of behavior, their weaknesses, their secret dependencies. Marcus Hendricks, she discovered, had a gambling problem that he funded through a complex series of shell companies and cryptocurrency transactions. The founding partner who had protected him, Alessandro Grimaldi, maintained an apartment in Geneva where he conducted meetings with clients who preferred to keep their financial arrangements confidential. The firm's managing director, Catherine Wong, had built her reputation on investment strategies that relied heavily on insider information obtained through her husband's position at the Italian Ministry of Finance. Elena spent 6 months documenting these discoveries, building detailed files on each individual, and slowly beginning to understand how power actually functioned within the organization. She learned to listen more carefully during meetings, to notice which topics made people uncomfortable, to recognize the subtle signals that indicated when someone was lying or hiding information. Most importantly, she learned to make herself indispensable to the right people while remaining invisible to everyone else. The opportunity to test her newfound understanding came when Alessandro Grimaldi asked her to prepare a confidential analysis of banking regulations in several Eastern European countries. Elena recognized immediately that this wasn't academic research but preliminary work for helping clients move questionable assets through jurisdictions with more flexible oversight. She completed the assignment flawlessly, providing exactly the information Grimaldi needed while carefully documenting every aspect of the request and its implications. 2 weeks later, when rumors began circulating about potential regulatory investigations into the firm's international practices, Elena found herself in possession of information that could either destroy careers or create powerful alliances. She chose the latter path, approaching Grimaldi privately and offering to provide him with advance warning of any developments that might affect his client's interests. The conversation was brief, professional, and utterly transformed Elena's position within the organization. Within 6 months, she had been promoted to senior analyst with her own research team. Within a year, she was attending confidential client meetings and helping to structure transactions that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal. She never asked for these opportunities directly, never pushed too hard for advancement. Instead, she made herself invaluable by anticipating needs, solving problems before they became crises, and always being available when senior partners needed someone who could be trusted with sensitive information. The most important lesson Elena learned during this period was that true power came not from holding official authority but from understanding the hidden dependencies that connected influential people. Every person in a position of power relied on others to maintain their status, and those relationships created vulnerabilities that could be carefully exploited by someone who took the time to understand them. Marcus Hendricks needed someone to cover his gambling debts. Alessandro Grimaldi needed someone who could navigate complex international regulations without asking uncomfortable questions. Catherine Wong needed someone who could provide plausible deniability when her investment strategies succeeded a little too consistently. Elena became that someone for all of them, not by blackmail or crude threats, but by making herself indispensable to their success. She learned to speak their languages, to understand their priorities, and to always provide them with solutions that advanced their interests while simultaneously advancing her own. The key was ensuring that helping her was always the path of least resistance for the people whose support she needed. When the opportunity arose to join the European Central Banking Authority, Elena recognized it as a chance to operate on a much larger scale. The position offered access to confidential information about monetary policy, regulatory decisions, and economic data that could influence markets across dozens of countries. More importantly, it placed her at the center of a network that included central bank governors, finance ministry officials, and senior executives from major financial institutions. The application process had been rigorous, requiring multiple interviews, extensive background checks, and detailed reviews of her professional qualifications. Elena had approached each step methodically, presenting herself as exactly the kind of competent, reliable, slightly boring bureaucrat that international institutions preferred to hire. She emphasized her technical expertise while downplaying her ambition, her analytical skills while minimizing her creativity, her language abilities while understating her international experience. The strategy worked perfectly. Her references described her as hardworking but not particularly ambitious, intelligent but not threatening, reliable but not remarkable. The background investigators found nothing questionable in her financial records, her travel history, or her professional associations. Her written work demonstrated technical competence without revealing any unconventional thinking or political opinions that might concern security reviewers. Elena's first year at the banking authority had been spent in careful observation and gradual positioning. She volunteered for assignments that other analysts found tedious, particularly those involving the review of complex regulatory filings and the preparation of technical reports for senior officials. This work was genuinely boring, but it provided her with comprehensive knowledge of how decisions were actually made within the institution and which individuals held real influence behind the official organizational charts. She discovered that Dr. Friedrich Weber, the nominal head of the Regulatory Compliance Division, was largely a figurehead whose authority had been gradually undermined by his deputy, Maria Santos, who had spent 15 years building relationships with national banking regulators across Europe. She learned that Jacques Dubois, the senior economist whose monetary policy recommendations carried enormous weight, was secretly struggling with early-stage dementia and relied heavily on a small team of junior researchers to prepare his analyses and talking points. Most significantly, Elena identified the informal network of relationships that really controlled policy decisions within the institution. This network centered around weekly dinners hosted by Ingrid Larsson, the Swedish representative to the Banking Authority's Governing Council, who used these social gatherings to build consensus among key officials before formal meetings took place. The dinners were officially unofficial, appearing on no calendars and generating no written records, but Elena quickly recognized them as the real venue where important decisions were made. Getting invited to these dinners required a different kind of strategy than Elena had employed at her previous job. The people involved were sophisticated, experienced professionals who had spent decades navigating international bureaucracies. They wouldn't be impressed by technical competence alone, nor could they be easily manipulated through crude leverage or blackmail. Instead, Elena needed to demonstrate value in ways that these individuals would recognize and appreciate. She began by making herself useful to Maria Santos, whose struggle to manage her incompetent superior while implementing actual regulatory policies had left her constantly overwhelmed and frustrated. Elena volunteered to take on additional research projects, always delivering work that was slightly better than requested and always ahead of deadline. More importantly, she learned to anticipate Santos's needs, preparing briefing materials before they were requested and identifying potential problems before they became crises. The breakthrough came when Elena noticed irregularities in regulatory filings from several major German banks. The discrepancies were subtle, buried in footnotes and technical appendices, but they suggested coordinated efforts to misrepresent certain types of derivative exposures. Elena spent 3 weeks conducting additional research, consulting with contacts at national regulatory agencies, and building a comprehensive analysis of what appeared to be a systematic attempt to circumvent new capital requirements. Instead of reporting her findings through official channels, Elena approached Maria Santos privately, presenting the information as a potential opportunity rather than a crisis. She suggested that early intervention might allow the banking authority to address the problem quietly while positioning Santos as someone who had proactively identified and solved a serious regulatory issue. Elena even prepared draft talking points that Santos could use when briefing senior officials, emphasizing her leadership in protecting European financial stability. The strategy worked exactly as Elena had anticipated. Santos used the information to initiate confidential discussions with German banking regulators, ultimately negotiating agreements that brought the banks into compliance without generating negative publicity or market disruption. Senior officials within the banking authority were impressed by Santos's sophisticated handling of a potentially explosive situation, while the German banks were grateful that their problems had been addressed discreetly rather than through public enforcement actions. Elena's role in identifying and analyzing the situation never appeared in any official reports, but Maria Santos understood exactly who deserved credit for her success. Within 2 months, Elena found herself assigned to high-priority projects that brought her into contact with senior officials from across the European banking system. Within 4 months, she received her first invitation to one of Ingrid Larsson's dinner parties. The dinners were held in a private room at an exclusive restaurant near the banking authority's headquarters, with attendance limited to 8 or 10 carefully selected individuals. The conversations were wide-ranging, touching on economic policy, political developments, and personal observations about their colleagues and competitors. Elena quickly recognized that these gatherings served multiple purposes. They allowed senior officials to coordinate their positions on important issues, they provided opportunities for informal alliance building, and they created a forum where sensitive information could be shared without creating permanent records. Elena's initial approach was to listen more than she spoke, contributing only when she had genuinely useful information or insights to share. She learned to read the subtle dynamics between different attendees, understanding who held real influence, who was seeking to advance particular agendas, and who might be vulnerable to persuasion or pressure. Most importantly, she began to understand how these informal relationships connected to larger networks of power and influence that extended far beyond the banking authority itself. Ingrid Larsson, Elena discovered, maintained regular contact with finance ministry officials in Stockholm, senior executives at major Scandinavian banks, and influential members of the European Parliament's Economic Affairs Committee. Jacques Dubois, despite his cognitive decline, retained important relationships with academic economists whose research influenced policy debates across multiple institutions. Even Maria Santos, who operated primarily within regulatory circles, had cultivated contacts among investigative journalists who covered European financial markets. Elena realized that her position within this network provided her with unprecedented access to information that could be used to anticipate market movements, regulatory changes, and political developments weeks or months before they became public knowledge. More importantly, she began to understand how this information could be used not just for personal advantage but as a tool for influencing the very decisions that created such valuable intelligence. The key insight came during a dinner conversation about proposed changes to European banking regulations. Several attendees were discussing the potential impact on different national banking systems, with particular concern about how new capital requirements might affect smaller institutions in Southern Europe. Elena listened carefully to the discussion, noting which officials seemed most concerned about specific aspects of the proposed changes and which appeared to be seeking compromises that would address legitimate concerns while maintaining the overall thrust of the regulatory reforms. After the dinner, Elena spent several days developing a detailed analysis of the proposed regulations, focusing on potential modifications that might address the concerns raised during the discussion while actually strengthening rather than weakening the overall regulatory framework. She identified specific technical adjustments that would reduce compliance costs for smaller banks without compromising systemic stability, and she prepared detailed justifications for each proposed change. Instead of circulating this analysis widely or presenting it through official channels, Elena shared it confidentially with three key individuals: Maria Santos, who would be responsible for implementing any regulatory changes; Jacques Dubois, whose economic analysis would influence senior officials' decisions about the proposals; and Ingrid Larsson, who would need to build consensus among national representatives for any modifications to the original framework. Each person received a slightly different version of the analysis, tailored to their specific responsibilities and concerns. Santos received detailed implementation guidance that would help her avoid potential problems during the rollout of new regulations. Dubois received economic modeling that supported his preferred approach to monetary policy coordination. Larsson received talking points that would help her address the concerns of smaller European Union member states while maintaining support from larger ones. The strategy worked better than Elena had anticipated. Within 2 weeks, each of the three officials had independently begun advocating for the specific modifications that Elena had proposed, presenting them as solutions they had developed through their own analysis and consultation. The proposals gained momentum quickly, supported by officials who believed they were advancing their own ideas rather than implementing someone else's agenda. Elena watched the process unfold with growing confidence in her ability to influence outcomes through careful manipulation of information and relationships. She was beginning to understand that real power didn't require holding official authority or making public declarations. Instead, it flowed through the ability to shape how influential people understood their options and to ensure that the choices they made aligned with her own objectives. The success of the regulatory modification strategy established Elena's reputation as someone whose analysis could be trusted and whose recommendations were worth considering. More importantly, it demonstrated her understanding of how to present ideas in ways that allowed others to take credit while ensuring that her objectives were achieved. This approach was particularly effective with senior officials who had their own political considerations and career objectives to manage. Elena's growing influence within the informal network around Ingrid Larsson's dinners began to attract attention from outside the banking authority. She started receiving invitations to conferences and symposiums where she encountered officials from national finance ministries, executives from major financial institutions, and representatives from international organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These broader connections provided Elena with access to information and perspectives that extended far beyond European banking regulation. She learned about planned infrastructure investments in emerging markets, anticipated changes in trade policies, and confidential negotiations between governments and international creditors. Most importantly, she began to understand how decisions made in different capitals and institutions connected to create larger patterns of economic and political change. Elena realized that her position at the banking authority was just the beginning of what could be achieved through the careful cultivation of influence and information. The real opportunity lay in understanding how power flowed through the complex networks that connected governments, financial institutions, and international organizations, and in positioning herself to shape those flows in ways that advanced her own objectives while appearing to serve the interests of others. The opportunity that would define Elena's ascent came disguised as a routine assignment from Maria Santos. The European Central Banking Authority had received a confidential request from the Greek Ministry of Finance to review proposed modifications to the country's debt restructuring agreements with international creditors. On the surface, this appeared to be standard technical assistance, the kind of bureaucratic collaboration that occurred regularly between European institutions. Elena immediately recognized it as something far more significant. Greece's financial situation remained precarious despite years of international intervention and domestic reforms. The country's debt-to-GDP ratio, while improved from crisis levels, still required careful management to avoid triggering another round of market speculation and political instability. More importantly, the confidential nature of the request suggested that Greek officials were considering changes to their existing agreements that might prove controversial with creditors or European partners. Elena volunteered to lead the technical review, arguing that her background in emerging market analysis and regulatory compliance made her particularly well suited for the assignment. Santos agreed, partly because Elena had become her most reliable analyst and, partly because the sensitive nature of the work required someone who could be trusted to maintain confidentiality while producing high-quality results. The initial briefing materials provided by the Greek ministry painted a picture of modest technical adjustments designed to improve compliance monitoring and streamline reporting requirements. Elena's experience had taught her to look beyond official explanations for the real motivations behind such requests, so she began conducting her own research into Greece's current economic situation and recent political developments. What she discovered was far more interesting than routine technical modifications. The Greek government was facing increasing domestic pressure to reduce the pace of privatization programs that had been mandated as part of earlier bailout agreements. Public opinion polls showed growing opposition to the sale of state assets, particularly ports, airports, and energy infrastructure that many Greeks viewed as strategic national resources. At the same time, European creditors were becoming increasingly concerned about the timeline for debt repayment and the sustainability of Greece's fiscal reforms. Several major German banks held significant portions of restructured Greek debt, and their executives had been quietly pressing European officials to ensure that repayment schedules remained on track. French financial institutions, which had exposure through complex derivative instruments, were similarly concerned about any changes that might affect the value of their positions. Elena realized that the Greek request for technical assistance was actually an attempt to create space for domestic political concessions without explicitly renegotiating the terms of international agreements. By framing substantial policy changes as minor technical modifications, Greek officials hoped to reduce domestic opposition while avoiding the perception among creditors that they were backing away from their commitments. This understanding transformed Elena's approach to the assignment from routine analysis to strategic positioning. She recognized that her role in reviewing the proposed modifications would give her advanced knowledge of policy changes that could significantly impact financial markets, political relationships within the European Union, and the broader trajectory of European integration efforts. More importantly, Elena saw an opportunity to influence the outcome in ways that would advance her own objectives while appearing to serve the legitimate interests of all parties involved. The key was developing modifications that would give Greek officials meaningful domestic political benefits while providing European creditors with additional assurances about long-term compliance and repayment. Elena spent 3 weeks conducting detailed analysis of the proposed changes, consulting with experts on Greek fiscal policy, and developing alternative approaches that might better serve the objectives of both sides. She discovered that many of the privatization programs that were generating domestic opposition in Greece were actually proceeding more slowly than anticipated, creating uncertainty among potential investors and reducing the revenue that the Greek government could expect from asset sales. At the same time, Elena identified several areas where enhanced monitoring and reporting requirements could provide creditors with better information about Greece's economic performance while giving Greek officials more flexibility in how they achieved specific fiscal targets. The key was shifting focus from rigid adherence to predetermined timelines toward more sophisticated metrics that measured actual economic outcomes and long-term sustainability. Elena's breakthrough insight came from understanding that the real concerns of European creditors weren't about the specific details of privatization programs or budget timelines, but about broader questions of political stability and economic competence within the Greek government. If those concerns could be addressed through alternative mechanisms, there might be room for significant modifications to existing agreements without triggering creditor resistance. She began developing a comprehensive alternative approach that would restructure the entire framework for monitoring Greek compliance with international agreements. Instead of focusing on specific policy commitments like privatization schedules, the new framework would emphasize broader economic indicators like growth rates, employment levels, and fiscal sustainability metrics. This approach would give Greek officials much more flexibility in how they achieved agreed-upon objectives while providing creditors with better information about overall economic performance. The genius of Elena's approach was that it presented these fundamental changes as technical improvements to existing monitoring systems rather than renegotiation of basic agreements. By framing flexibility as enhanced oversight and presenting domestic political accommodation as improved economic management, Elena created a framework that both sides could embrace without appearing to compromise their original positions. Before presenting her recommendations to Maria Santos or Greek officials, Elena began testing her ideas through informal conversations with contacts in her expanding network. She arranged a coffee meeting with Henrik Johansson, a senior economist at the Swedish Central Bank who had been involved in the original Greek bailout negotiations, to discuss general questions about debt sustainability monitoring in small European economies. During their conversation, Elena presented her framework modifications as academic speculation about how monitoring systems might be improved based on lessons learned from Greece and other cases. Johansson was immediately interested, particularly in the idea of shifting focus from specific policy commitments to broader economic outcomes. He suggested that this approach might be applicable not just to Greece but to other countries that had received European financial assistance. Elena's next conversation was with Isabella Ricci, a senior analyst at the Italian Treasury who specialized in European Union fiscal coordination. Ricci had been following developments in Greece carefully, both because of Italy's own debt concerns and because of broader questions about how European institutions managed financial assistance programs. When Elena described her alternative monitoring framework, Ricci immediately grasped its potential implications for other European countries facing similar pressures. These conversations confirmed Elena's assessment that her approach addressed genuine concerns among European officials about the effectiveness of existing oversight mechanisms. More importantly, they suggested that her ideas might find support among influential figures who weren't directly involved in Greek negotiations but who had broader institutional interests in improving how European financial assistance programs functioned. Armed with this intelligence, Elena refined her recommendations and prepared a comprehensive presentation for Maria Santos. The document emphasized technical improvements and institutional learning rather than political accommodation, presenting the proposed changes as natural evolution of existing oversight systems rather than fundamental renegotiation of Greek commitments. Santos was impressed by the sophistication of Elena's analysis and the clarity of her recommendations. More importantly, she immediately understood that the approach Elena had developed could enhance her own reputation as an innovative regulator who had found creative solutions to complex institutional challenges. Santos arranged for Elena to present her recommendations directly to senior banking authority officials, including Dr. Friedrich Weber and members of the Governing Council. The presentation was scheduled for a closed session of the Banking Authority's Policy Coordination Committee, with attendance limited to senior officials and selected technical experts. Elena prepared extensively, anticipating potential questions and developing detailed responses that emphasized the technical merits of her approach while minimizing discussion of its political implications. The meeting exceeded Elena's expectations. Dr. Weber was particularly interested in the institutional precedent that might be established by the new monitoring framework, noting that similar approaches could be applied to other European countries receiving financial assistance. Jacques Dubois raised thoughtful questions about the economic modeling underlying Elena's recommendations, allowing her to demonstrate the depth of her technical analysis and her understanding of complex fiscal dynamics. Most importantly, Ingrid Larsson immediately grasped the broader political significance of Elena's approach. During a break in the meeting, Larsson approached Elena privately to discuss how the proposed framework might be received by national governments and European Parliament committees that had oversight responsibilities for financial assistance programs. Larsson's response confirmed Elena's assessment that her recommendations addressed concerns that extended far beyond the specific case of Greece. European officials were increasingly worried about the sustainability of existing approaches to financial assistance, particularly given growing domestic opposition in both creditor and debtor countries. Elena's framework offered a path toward more flexible and politically sustainable arrangements without appearing to compromise the fundamental principles underlying European financial integration. Within a week of Elena's presentation, the Banking Authority had approved her recommendations for implementation in the Greek case. More significantly, senior officials had begun discussing the potential for applying similar approaches to other countries and situations. Elena found herself appointed to lead a small working group tasked with developing more detailed guidelines for implementing the new monitoring framework and assessing its potential application to other European financial assistance programs. The working group assignment provided Elena with unprecedented access to confidential information about European Union financial policy and ongoing negotiations with multiple member states. She learned about confidential discussions with Italian officials about debt sustainability, preliminary conversations with Portuguese authorities about infrastructure investment programs, and early planning for potential financial assistance to Eastern European countries facing economic pressures related to energy security. More importantly, Elena's role in developing the new monitoring framework positioned her as a key figure in discussions about the future of European financial integration. Senior officials from national finance ministries began seeking her input on questions related to fiscal coordination and debt sustainability. Representatives from the International Monetary Fund and World Bank expressed interest in adapting her approach for use in other regions. Elena realized that her success with the Greek case had established her as someone whose expertise was valued by influential decision-makers across multiple institutions. This reputation created opportunities for her to influence policy development in ways that extended far beyond her official responsibilities at the banking authority. The next phase of Elena's strategy focused on leveraging her growing influence to position herself for even greater access to decision-making processes. She began accepting invitations to speak at international conferences, always presenting her work in terms of technical innovation and institutional improvement rather than political strategy. These speaking engagements allowed her to build relationships with officials from organizations like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Bank for International Settlements, and various national central banks. Each new relationship provided Elena with additional sources of information and influence. She learned about planned policy changes before they were announced publicly, gained insight into the priorities and concerns of key decision-makers, and gradually developed a comprehensive understanding of how power flowed through the complex network of institutions that managed international economic cooperation. Elena's growing network also provided her with opportunities to influence policy development through informal consultation and advice. Officials who were working on difficult problems increasingly sought her input, knowing that her recommendations would be sophisticated, practical, and politically aware. Elena carefully cultivated this reputation, always providing valuable assistance while ensuring that her advice advanced her own objectives. The culmination of this phase came when Elena received an invitation to participate in a confidential consultation organized by the German Finance Ministry. Senior officials from several European countries were being asked to provide input on proposed changes to European Union fiscal rules that would govern how member states manage debt and deficits in the post-pandemic environment. The consultation was highly sensitive, involving discussions about fundamental aspects of European economic governance that could affect the sovereignty and fiscal autonomy of member states. Elena's invitation to participate reflected her growing reputation as someone whose technical expertise and political judgment could be trusted by officials dealing with the most sensitive aspects of European integration. Elena approached the consultation as an opportunity to demonstrate her value to a broader network of influential officials while gaining access to information that could be used to anticipate and influence major policy developments. She prepared extensively, developing detailed analysis of different approaches to fiscal coordination and their potential implications for various member states. The consultation took place over 2 days at a government facility outside Berlin, with participants including finance ministry officials from 6 European countries, senior economists from major central banks, and representatives from key European Union institutions. The discussions were frank and wide-ranging, covering everything from technical questions about debt sustainability metrics to fundamental philosophical questions about the balance between national sovereignty and European integration. Elena's contributions to the discussions were carefully calibrated to demonstrate expertise while building relationships with key participants. She provided thoughtful analysis of technical issues while showing appreciation for the political constraints facing officials from different countries. Most importantly, she demonstrated her understanding of how policy development in one area connected to broader questions of institutional design and political feasibility. By the end of the consultation, Elena had established working relationships with senior officials from multiple European governments and had gained insight into policy development processes that would shape European economic governance for years to come. She had also demonstrated her value as someone who could contribute meaningfully to high-level policy discussions while maintaining appropriate confidentiality about sensitive information. The German consultation represented a turning point in Elena's trajectory from mid-level analyst to influential policy advisor. Her growing network of relationships provided her with access to information and decision-making processes that extended far beyond her official position at the banking authority. More importantly, she had demonstrated her ability to influence policy outcomes through careful analysis, strategic relationship building, and sophisticated understanding of institutional dynamics. Elena realized that she was approaching a critical decision point in her career. Her success had positioned her for potentially significant opportunities, including senior positions at major international organizations, advisory roles with important governments, or leadership positions within the private sector. Each path offered different advantages and risks, and Elena understood that her next move would largely determine the scope and nature of her future influence. As she weighed these options, Elena remained focused on her fundamental objective, maximizing her ability to understand and influence the forces that shaped economic and political outcomes on a global scale. She had learned that true power came not from holding official authority but from understanding the hidden relationships and dependencies that connected influential institutions and individuals. Her next challenge was translating this understanding into a position that would allow her to operate at an even higher level of influence and impact. The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning in March, while Elena was reviewing overnight developments in Asian financial markets. The caller identified himself as Michael Harrison, senior partner at Blackstone Advisory, one of the world's most prestigious strategic consulting firms. Harrison explained that he had followed Elena's work on European fiscal coordination with considerable interest and wondered if she might be available for a confidential conversation about potential opportunities. Elena had heard of Blackstone Advisory, though the firm maintained such a low profile that most people outside elite financial and political circles remained unaware of its existence. Blackstone didn't advertise its services or seek public recognition for its work. Instead, the firm provided strategic advice to governments, central banks, and major financial institutions on their most sensitive challenges. Blackstone's client list was never published, but rumors suggested it included heads of state, sovereign wealth funds, and multinational corporations facing existential threats or unprecedented opportunities. The meeting was arranged for the following week at a private club in London's Mayfair district. Elena took personal leave from the banking authority, ostensibly to attend an academic conference, and flew to London with carefully managed expectations about what Blackstone might offer. She had learned to approach such opportunities with strategic skepticism, understanding that seemingly attractive offers often came with hidden costs or obligations. Michael Harrison proved to be exactly what Elena had expected: impeccably dressed, supremely confident, and obviously accustomed to dealing with highly sophisticated and ambitious people. Over lunch in the club's private dining room, Harrison outlined Blackstone's interest in Elena's expertise and its need for someone with her particular combination of technical knowledge, institutional relationships, and analytical capability. Blackstone, Harrison explained, was developing a new practice area focused on what he termed institutional intelligence. The firm's traditional consulting work involved helping clients navigate specific challenges or opportunities, but institutional intelligence represented something fundamentally different. Instead of reacting to developments after they occurred, this practice would help clients understand and influence the decision-making processes that created those developments in the first place. The concept immediately captured Elena's imagination. Harrison was describing exactly the kind of strategic positioning that Elena had been developing through her work at the banking authority, but on a global scale and with resources that dwarfed anything available to individual institutions. Blackstone's clients included entities with the power to influence major policy decisions, market outcomes, and political developments across multiple countries and regions. Elena listened carefully as Harrison described the specific role that Blackstone had in mind for her. She would serve as Director of European Institutional Intelligence, with responsibility for understanding and predicting policy developments within European Union institutions, national governments, and major financial organizations. More importantly, she would help clients position themselves to influence those developments in ways that advanced their strategic objectives. The position offered several advantages that went far beyond the substantial compensation package Harrison outlined. Elena would have access to information and analysis capabilities that no individual institution could provide, including real-time intelligence about policy development in dozens of countries, sophisticated modeling of political and economic scenarios, and direct relationships with decision-makers at the highest levels of government and business. Perhaps most significantly, the role would allow Elena to operate with a degree of independence and influence that would be impossible to achieve within any single institution. Blackstone's clients included entities with conflicting interests and objectives, which meant that Elena would need to develop strategies that served her own goals while appearing to advance the interests of multiple parties. This requirement perfectly matched Elena's approach to institutional influence, which had always emphasized creating win-win scenarios that advanced her objectives while providing tangible benefits to others. Elena spent 3 days considering Harrison's offer, using the time to conduct her own research into Blackstone Advisory and its client base. What she discovered confirmed her impression that the firm operated at the intersection of high-level politics, international finance, and global economic policy. Blackstone's partners included former finance ministers, ex-central bank governors, and retired senior officials from international organizations like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. More importantly, Elena's research suggested that Blackstone had played significant but largely invisible roles in several major policy developments over the previous decade. The firm's analysts had apparently provided crucial intelligence during the 2015 Greek debt crisis, the Brexit negotiations, and the early stages of trade tensions between the United States and China. In each case, Blackstone's involvement had become known only through fragmentary references in memoirs published years later by former officials. Elena accepted Harrison's offer, but with carefully negotiated modifications to the original terms. She insisted on maintaining her academic and research relationships, arguing that her value to Blackstone depended partly on her continued access to information and perspectives from outside the firm's client base. She also negotiated unusually broad latitude in choosing which projects to work on and how to approach them, understanding that her effectiveness would depend on maintaining her reputation for independence and objectivity. The transition from the European Central Banking Authority to Blackstone required delicate management. Elena couldn't simply resign without raising questions about her motivations and destinations, particularly given her access to sensitive information about European financial policy. Instead, she negotiated a gradual transition that would allow her to complete several important projects at the banking authority while beginning to take on limited consulting assignments for Blackstone. Elena's final major project at the banking authority involved developing recommendations for enhanced cooperation between European and American financial regulators. The assignment reflected growing concern among European officials about the extraterritorial effects of American banking regulations and the need for better coordination to avoid conflicts that might disrupt international financial markets. Elena approached this project with particular intensity, understanding that it represented an opportunity to establish her credentials with American officials and institutions while demonstrating her value to Blackstone's client base. She spent 6 weeks conducting interviews with officials from both sides of the Atlantic, analyzing the technical and political factors that complicated regulatory coordination, and developing specific recommendations for improving cooperation without compromising the independence of either regulatory system. Her final report exceeded all expectations, providing not just technical recommendations but sophisticated analysis of the political dynamics that would determine whether enhanced cooperation could be successfully implemented. Elena identified specific individuals within both systems who would need to champion closer coordination, outlined potential obstacles that would need to be overcome, and suggested strategies for building the institutional relationships necessary for long-term success. The report's reception confirmed Elena's assessment of her growing influence within international policy circles. Senior officials at the Federal Reserve, the Treasury Department, and key European regulatory agencies requested copies of her analysis, while several academic institutions invited her to present her findings at closed conferences for senior practitioners and scholars. More significantly, Elena's work on regulatory coordination established her as someone who understood not just European institutional dynamics but the broader challenges of international policy cooperation. This reputation would prove invaluable in her new role at Blackstone, where many clients were struggling with the complexities of operating across multiple regulatory jurisdictions and political systems. Elena officially joined Blackstone in September, establishing her office in the firm's discreet London location near St. James's Park. The office building appeared unremarkable from the outside, housing what seemed to be various small financial services firms and consulting companies. Only the sophisticated security systems and carefully screened access procedures hinted at the sensitive nature of the work conducted within. Elena's initial assignments at Blackstone involved providing analysis and strategic advice to clients facing regulatory challenges in European markets. Her first major project involved helping a sovereign wealth fund navigate changing investment regulations in several European Union countries while positioning the fund to take advantage of new opportunities in European infrastructure development. The project required Elena to analyze not just current regulations but the political and economic factors likely to influence future policy development. She needed to understand which European officials might be receptive to specific types of infrastructure investment, how domestic political considerations might affect regulatory decisions in different countries, and what kinds of partnerships might help the sovereign wealth fund achieve its investment objectives while addressing European concerns about foreign ownership of strategic assets. Elena's approach to this assignment reflected her broader strategic philosophy. She sought to understand all parties' true objectives and constraints, then develop solutions that advanced her clients' interests while providing tangible benefits to European officials and institutions. The key was identifying areas where the sovereign wealth fund's investment capacity aligned with European infrastructure needs and political priorities. Her analysis revealed significant opportunities in renewable energy infrastructure, digital communications networks, and transportation systems that would support European economic integration. More importantly, Elena identified specific ways that the sovereign wealth fund could structure its investments to address European concerns about technology transfer, employment creation, and long-term asset control. Elena's recommendations involved creating partnership structures that would give European entities meaningful roles in project governance while ensuring that the sovereign wealth fund achieved its financial and strategic objectives. She outlined specific approaches for different countries based on their particular political sensitivities and economic priorities, and she identified key officials who would need to support such arrangements for them to be successfully implemented. The success of this project established Elena's reputation within Blackstone as someone who could navigate complex political environments while delivering concrete results for clients. More importantly, it demonstrated her ability to understand and influence decision-making processes across multiple institutions and jurisdictions simultaneously. Elena's next major assignment involved providing strategic intelligence about European Central Bank monetary policy to a group of institutional investors managing currency and interest rate exposures across European markets. The clients needed to understand not just what policy decisions were likely to be made but when they would be announced and how they would be implemented across different European countries. This assignment required Elena to leverage her extensive network of contacts within European financial institutions while developing new sources of information about European Central Bank decision-making processes. She needed to understand the personal dynamics between key officials, the institutional factors that influenced policy development, and the political considerations that might affect timing and implementation of major policy changes. Elena's analysis of European central bank dynamics drew on her deep understanding of how informal networks influenced official decision-making processes. She identified the key relationships between national central bank governors, the influence patterns within the bank's governing council, and the communication strategies that officials used to prepare markets for policy changes. Her intelligence reports provided clients with sophisticated understanding of policy development timelines, potential modification factors that might influence final decisions, and implementation strategies that would affect how policy changes translated into market outcomes. More importantly, Elena's analysis helped clients position themselves to benefit from policy changes while avoiding the risks associated with unexpected developments or implementation challenges. The success of Elena's work on European monetary policy intelligence established her as Blackstone's leading expert on European institutional dynamics. Senior partners began involving her in strategic discussions about the firm's broader European client development, and she was asked to provide input on potential new service offerings that might serve clients with interests across multiple European markets. Elena realized that her position at Blackstone provided her with unprecedented access to information about global financial and political developments. The firm's clients included entities involved in major policy decisions across dozens of countries, and Elena's role in serving those clients gave her insight into political and economic developments weeks or months before they became public knowledge. More importantly, Elena began to understand how her analysis and recommendations influenced not just her clients' strategies but the actual policy outcomes that created market opportunities and risks. When her institutional intelligence helped clients anticipate regulatory changes, their investment and positioning decisions could influence the scale and timing of those changes. When her strategic advice helped clients build relationships with key officials, those relationships could affect how policies were developed and implemented. Elena was beginning to operate at a level where analysis and influence merged into something approaching control over the institutional processes that shaped major economic and political outcomes. Her recommendations didn't just help clients adapt to developments, they helped determine what those developments would be and how they would unfold. This realization led Elena to begin thinking about her long-term objectives in fundamentally different terms. Instead of seeking to maximize her position within existing institutional structures, she began considering how those structures themselves might be modified to create new opportunities for influence and control. Elena was moving beyond the traditional boundaries of consulting and strategic advice towards something more ambitious and potentially transformative. The opportunity to test these ideas would come sooner than Elena anticipated, as Blackstone's clients faced increasingly complex challenges that required not just sophisticated analysis but active intervention in policy development processes. Elena's role was about to evolve from providing intelligence about institutional dynamics to helping reshape those dynamics in ways that served her clients' interests while advancing her own objectives for influence and control over the forces that shaped global economic and political outcomes. The crisis that would test Elena's capabilities emerged from an unexpected direction: a series of coordinated cyber attacks against financial institutions across Eastern Europe that threatened to destabilize the region's banking systems and trigger broader economic panic. The attacks began in the early hours of a Thursday morning in November, when sophisticated malware simultaneously penetrated the networks of major banks in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Within hours, the attacks had spread to financial institutions in Slovakia, Romania, and the Baltic states. The malware was designed not just to disrupt operations but to systematically corrupt transaction records and customer data in ways that would take weeks or months to fully resolve. More concerning still, the attacks appeared to be coordinated with market manipulation strategies that suggested the involvement of well-funded and highly sophisticated actors. Elena learned about the crisis through an emergency call from Michael Harrison, who explained that several of Blackstone's clients had significant exposures to Eastern European markets and needed immediate intelligence about the scope of the crisis and potential policy responses. More importantly, one of Blackstone's most important clients, a major sovereign wealth fund with substantial investments in the region, was facing potential losses in the hundreds of millions of dollars if the crisis couldn't be contained quickly. The immediate challenge was understanding who was behind the attacks and what their ultimate objectives might be. The sophistication of the malware and the coordination of the market manipulation suggested state-sponsored involvement, but identifying the specific actors and their motivations would require access to intelligence that went far beyond traditional financial analysis. Elena's first step was activating her network of contacts within European security and intelligence agencies. Her years of building relationships across various institutions had included developing connections with officials who worked at the intersection of financial regulation and national security policy. These relationships, cultivated carefully over time through conferences, working groups, and informal consultations, now provided Elena with access to preliminary intelligence about the cyber attacks. Through a former colleague who had moved from the European Central Banking Authority to the European Union's Cybersecurity Agency, Elena learned that initial forensic analysis suggested the attacks had been launched from servers in multiple jurisdictions, using techniques that had previously been associated with advanced persistent threat groups linked to nation-state actors. More significantly, the timing and targeting of the attacks appeared designed to maximize disruption during a period when European officials were engaged in sensitive negotiations about energy security and defense cooperation. Elena's second source of intelligence came from Henrik Johansson at the Swedish Central Bank, who had been coordinating with other Nordic central banks to assess potential contagion effects from the Eastern European crisis. Johansson revealed that Swedish intelligence agencies had detected unusual trading patterns in several Nordic financial markets during the hours preceding the cyber attacks, suggesting that someone had positioned themselves to profit from market volatility before the attacks became public knowledge. This information transformed Elena's understanding of the crisis from a reactive cybersecurity incident to a proactive operation designed to achieve specific political and economic objectives. The attackers weren't simply trying to disrupt financial systems, they were orchestrating a complex strategy that combined cyber warfare, market manipulation, and political pressure to influence European policy decisions about regional security and economic cooperation. Elena realized that responding effectively to this crisis would require more than traditional intelligence gathering and analysis. Her clients needed strategies that could address not just the immediate financial impacts but the broader political implications of the attacks. More importantly, Elena saw an opportunity to demonstrate Blackstone's value by helping to shape the official response to the crisis in ways that protected her clients' interests while advancing broader European security objectives. Elena's approach to the crisis reflected her sophisticated understanding of how modern influence operations functioned across multiple domains simultaneously. She began developing a comprehensive response strategy that would address cybersecurity, financial stability, market confidence, and political coordination challenges through a series of coordinated interventions designed to appear as natural institutional responses to the developing crisis. Her first intervention involved reaching out to Maria Santos, who had become a senior official at the European Banking Authority and was now coordinating the official response to the cyber attacks. Elena approached Santos not as a representative of Blackstone's clients but as an independent expert offering analytical support during a challenging period. She provided Santos with detailed assessment of the attack's potential systemic implications and specific recommendations for stabilizing markets while maintaining public confidence in financial institutions. Elena's analysis emphasized the importance of coordinating responses across multiple European institutions to avoid creating opportunities for further market manipulation. She recommended establishing a temporary coordination mechanism that would allow banking regulators, cybersecurity agencies, and market oversight bodies to share information and synchronize their responses to prevent the attackers from exploiting institutional gaps or communication delays. Most importantly, Elena's recommendations included specific proposals for reassuring international investors and financial institutions about the security and stability of European financial markets. These proposals were designed to address the concerns of Blackstone's clients while providing European officials with practical tools for managing the crisis effectively. Santos was grateful for Elena's analysis and immediately began incorporating her recommendations into the official coordination mechanisms being established to manage the crisis response. Elena's suggestions about international investor reassurance became key elements of public statements issued by senior European officials, while her proposals for institutional coordination influenced the structure of emergency working groups established to monitor and respond to ongoing developments. Elena's second intervention involved working with Jacques Dubois, whose position at the European Central Banking Authority gave him influence over monetary policy responses to the crisis. Elena approached Dubois with analysis suggesting that the cyber attacks might be followed by additional market manipulation designed to trigger currency instability and undermine confidence in the European monetary system. Elena's analysis was sophisticated and alarming. She outlined specific scenarios in which coordinated selling pressure against Eastern European currencies could create cascading effects that would force European Central Bank intervention to prevent broader monetary instability. More importantly, she provided Dubois with detailed recommendations for preemptive policy measures that could discourage such manipulation while reassuring markets about the central bank's commitment to monetary stability. Dubois found Elena's analysis compelling and immediately began consulting with colleagues about implementing some of her recommendations. Elena's suggestions influenced the European Central Bank's public statements about monitoring currency markets and its private communications with national central banks about coordinated intervention strategies. Most importantly, her analysis helped shape the timing and content of policy announcements that were designed to deter further market manipulation. Elena's third intervention was perhaps the most sophisticated. she arranged for key information about the crisis to reach American intelligence and financial regulatory agencies through carefully managed channels that would encourage coordinated transatlantic responses without revealing the source of the intelligence or its connection to Blackstone's client interests. Working through her expanding network of contacts in international financial institutions, Elena ensured that American officials learned about specific aspects of the cyber attacks and market manipulation that suggested broader threats to transatlantic financial stability. She provided this information in ways that would encourage American agencies to share their own intelligence and coordinate their responses with European counterparts. The result was exactly what Elena had anticipated. American officials began reaching out to European counterparts to offer assistance and coordinate responses to what they increasingly understood as a broader threat to transatlantic financial security. This coordination provided European officials with additional resources and intelligence while creating political pressure for robust responses that would deter future attacks. More importantly for Elena's clients, the transatlantic coordination created opportunities for American and European officials to discuss broader questions about financial market security and regulatory cooperation. These discussions provided Elena's clients with advance intelligence about potential policy changes that could affect their investment strategies and risk management approaches across multiple markets. Elena's final intervention involved working with Ingrid Larson to develop strategies for addressing the political implications of the cyber attacks within broader European Union institutional processes. Elena recognized that the crisis would inevitably lead to discussions about enhanced cybersecurity cooperation, increased defense spending, and potentially controversial decisions about technology procurement and foreign investment oversight. Elena provided Larson with sophisticated analysis of how the crisis might affect ongoing political negotiations within the European Union, including discussions about energy security, defense cooperation, and institutional reform. More importantly, Elena outlined specific strategies that European officials could use to turn the crisis into an opportunity for advancing integration and cooperation in areas that had previously been politically difficult to address. Larson was impressed by Elena's analysis and began incorporating her recommendations into confidential discussions with colleagues from other European Union member states. Elena's suggestions influenced the content of policy proposals that were developed in response to the crisis, while her strategic advice helped shape the timing and presentation of initiatives designed to enhance European cybersecurity and financial security cooperation. Within 2 weeks of the initial attacks, Elena's multifaceted intervention strategy had succeeded beyond her most optimistic expectations. The immediate crisis had been contained through coordinated European and American responses that prevented systemic financial instability while deterring further attacks. More importantly, the crisis response had created new institutional relationships and cooperation mechanisms that would influence European financial and security policy for years to come. For Blackstone's clients, Elena's strategy had delivered exceptional results. The sovereign wealth fund's exposure to Eastern European markets had been protected through policy responses that stabilized financial institutions and currency markets. Other clients had benefited from advance intelligence about policy changes that allowed them to position themselves advantageously as markets recovered from the initial shock of the attacks. Perhaps most significantly, Elena's role in shaping the crisis response had established her as someone whose analysis and recommendations were valued by senior officials across multiple institutions and jurisdictions. Her influence now extended beyond traditional consulting relationships to something approaching policy partnership with officials responsible for making decisions that affected global financial stability. Elena realized that her success in managing the Eastern European cyber crisis had demonstrated the potential for strategic influence operations that extended far beyond traditional consulting or advisory relationships. By understanding how different institutions and decision-makers responded to crisis situations, Elena had been able to shape outcomes in ways that served multiple objectives simultaneously while appearing to represent natural institutional responses to developing challenges. This success established Elena as one of Blackstone's most valuable partners and opened opportunities for even more ambitious projects. Senior partners began involving Elena in strategic discussions about the firm's long-term development, including potential expansion into new markets and service areas that would require her expertise in institutional influence and policy development. More importantly, Elena's success had demonstrated her ability to operate effectively at the highest levels of international financial and security policy. She had proven that her understanding of institutional dynamics could be translated into concrete influence over major policy decisions that affected global economic and political outcomes. Elena began planning her next phase of development, focusing on opportunities that would allow her to extend her influence beyond reactive crisis management toward proactive shaping of the institutional environment in which future crises would develop. She was moving beyond traditional boundaries between private sector strategic advice and public sector policy development toward something that approximated systemic influence over the forces that shaped international economic and political relationships. The Eastern European cyber crisis had been a test of Elena's capabilities and strategic vision. Her success in managing the crisis while advancing her clients' interests and her own objectives for institutional influence had proven that her approach to power and influence could be effective at the highest levels of international policy and financial markets. Elena was ready for the challenges and opportunities that would define the next phase of her remarkable career in strategic influence and institutional control. 2 years after the Eastern European cyber crisis, Elena found herself facing an opportunity that would test everything she had learned about power, influence, and strategic positioning. The call came from David Chen, managing director of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, who explained that the bank was seeking candidates for a new position, Director of Global Strategic Coordination, with responsibility for managing the bank's relationships with other international financial institutions and coordinating responses to emerging global economic challenges. The position represented something unprecedented in Elena's experience, the opportunity to operate at the center of global economic policy development, with official authority to influence how major international institutions coordinated their responses to financial crises, development challenges, and systemic risks. More importantly, the role would position Elena to shape the institutional architecture that would govern international economic cooperation for decades to come. Elena's reputation had preceded her to Beijing. Chen explained that senior officials at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank had followed her work on European financial coordination, her analysis of regulatory cooperation challenges, and her role in managing responses to the cyber crisis. They were particularly impressed by her ability to build consensus among institutions with different objectives and priorities while developing practical solutions to complex political and technical challenges. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank represented a unique opportunity for Elena because of its position at the intersection of established international financial institutions and emerging economic powers. Founded by China as an alternative to Western-dominated institutions like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, the bank had gradually developed into a bridge between different approaches to international economic cooperation. Elena's potential role would involve managing relationships not just with traditional international financial institutions but with sovereign wealth funds, regional development banks, and bilateral investment agencies from countries across Asia, Europe, and other regions. More significantly, she would be responsible for developing new frameworks for coordination that could address emerging challenges like climate change, technological disruption, and geopolitical tensions that existing institutions weren't well equipped to handle. The position offered Elena several advantages that went beyond even the extraordinary resources and access provided by her role at Blackstone. She would have official authority to convene meetings between senior officials from multiple institutions, to propose new coordination mechanisms, and to represent the bank in discussions about fundamental questions of international economic governance. Perhaps most importantly, Elena would be positioned to influence the development of new institutional relationships and cooperation frameworks that could reshape how international economic cooperation functioned in response to emerging global challenges. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was actively seeking to establish itself as a key player in discussions about climate finance, digital infrastructure development, and economic integration across multiple regions. Elena spent several weeks conducting detailed analysis of the opportunity before making her decision. Her research confirmed that the position would provide her with unprecedented access to decision-making processes across the international economic system while allowing her to maintain the independence and flexibility that had been crucial to her success at Blackstone. More importantly, Elena realized that the role would allow her to implement her strategic vision on a global scale. Instead of influencing specific policy decisions through indirect means, she would have official responsibility for developing the coordination mechanisms and institutional relationships that would shape how such decisions were made across multiple institutions and jurisdictions. Elena accepted Chen's offer, but with carefully negotiated terms that would allow her to maintain certain consulting relationships and academic affiliations that were crucial to her broader network and influence. She also insisted on establishing a small team of analysts and coordinators who would report directly to her and who could be trusted to implement sophisticated strategies across multiple time zones and institutional cultures. The transition from Blackstone to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank required delicate management of Elena's existing relationships and commitments. She couldn't simply abandon the network she had built over years of careful cultivation, nor could she ignore the interests of clients who had come to depend on her analysis and strategic advice. Elena negotiated an arrangement that allowed her to maintain informal advisory relationships with key contacts while transitioning her formal responsibilities to colleagues at Blackstone who had worked closely with her on major projects. This approach preserved the valuable relationships she had built while ensuring that her former clients continued to receive high-quality strategic support during the transition period. Elena's first major challenge at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank involved developing a comprehensive strategy for enhanced coordination between international financial institutions in response to emerging climate change challenges. The bank had committed substantial resources to clean energy and sustainable infrastructure projects, but senior officials recognized that addressing climate change effectively would require unprecedented cooperation between institutions with different mandates, priorities, and operational approaches. Elena approached this challenge as an opportunity to demonstrate her value to the bank while establishing her influence within the broader network of international financial institutions. She began by conducting detailed analysis of existing coordination mechanisms, identifying gaps and inefficiencies that prevented effective cooperation, and developing specific proposals for enhanced coordination that would benefit all participating institutions. Her analysis revealed that most existing coordination mechanisms were designed for a previous era of international economic cooperation, when challenges were less complex and institutions had more clearly defined and separate roles. Climate change presented fundamentally different challenges that required institutions to coordinate not just their financing decisions but their policy development, risk assessment, and project implementation strategies. Elena's breakthrough insight came from recognizing that effective climate coordination would require creating new institutional relationships that went beyond traditional funding partnerships. Institutions would need to share information, coordinate policies, and align their strategic priorities in ways that had never been necessary for addressing previous development challenges. Elena designed a comprehensive coordination framework that would create systematic information sharing mechanisms, joint policy development processes, and coordinated project implementation strategies that could be adapted to different regional and sectoral contexts. More importantly, her framework was designed to enhance rather than threaten the autonomy and distinct advantages of participating institutions. The genius of Elena's approach was that she presented enhanced coordination as a strategy for increasing rather than limiting each institution's effectiveness and influence. By working together more systematically, institutions could undertake larger and more complex projects, share risks more effectively, and achieve greater impact with their available resources. Elena's coordination framework was tested through a pilot program focused on sustainable infrastructure development across Southeast Asia. The pilot involved coordinating investments and policy development across 6 different international institutions, including traditional development banks, newer institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and bilateral investment agencies from major donor countries. The results exceeded all expectations. The coordinated approach allowed participating institutions to finance larger infrastructure projects while sharing technical expertise and risk management capabilities that no single institution could have provided independently. More importantly, the coordination mechanisms Elena had designed created opportunities for policy innovation and institutional learning that benefited all participants. The success of the Southeast Asia pilot established Elena's reputation as someone who could design and implement sophisticated coordination strategies that enhanced rather than threatened institutional effectiveness. Senior officials from participating institutions began seeking her input on other coordination challenges, while governments and private sector organizations started requesting her advice on how to work more effectively with international financial institutions. Elena's next major project involved developing coordination strategies for addressing economic disruption caused by technological change and digitalization. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank had identified digital infrastructure development as a priority area, but Elena recognized that addressing digitalization challenges effectively would require coordination not just between financial institutions but between development organizations, technology companies, and regulatory agencies across multiple countries. Elena's approach to this challenge reflected her sophisticated understanding of how technological change was reshaping the institutional environment in which international economic cooperation took place. Traditional approaches to development finance were poorly suited to addressing challenges like cybersecurity, data governance, and the economic disruption caused by automation and artificial intelligence. Elena developed a comprehensive framework for digital cooperation that brought together international financial institutions, technology companies, regulatory agencies, and academic research organizations in systematic collaboration on digital infrastructure development and governance challenges. Her framework created mechanisms for sharing information about emerging technologies, coordinating regulatory approaches, and developing joint projects that could address digital development challenges while managing associated risks. The Digital Cooperation Framework was implemented through a series of regional initiatives that addressed specific challenges like improving internet connectivity in underserved areas, developing cybersecurity capabilities in emerging economies, and creating regulatory frameworks that could support innovation while protecting consumers and maintaining financial stability. Elena's success with digital cooperation established her as a leading figure in discussions about how international institutions needed to adapt to address 21st-century development challenges. Senior officials from major institutions began consulting with her about fundamental questions of institutional design and strategic priority setting, while governments started seeking her advice on how to position themselves effectively within evolving international cooperation frameworks. Perhaps most significantly, Elena's work on climate and digital cooperation had demonstrated her ability to create new forms of institutional collaboration that enhanced the effectiveness of existing organizations while addressing challenges that no single institution could tackle independently. She had proven that her understanding of institutional dynamics could be translated into concrete improvements in international economic cooperation. Elena's growing influence within international financial institutions provided her with unprecedented access to information about global economic and political developments. Her role required her to maintain regular communication with senior officials from dozens of institutions across multiple regions, giving her comprehensive understanding of how major economic and political trends were developing across different countries and sectors. More importantly, Elena's position allowed her to influence not just specific policy decisions but the institutional frameworks within which such decisions were made. Her coordination mechanisms were becoming permanent features of international economic cooperation, shaping how institutions approached challenges ranging from infrastructure development to regulatory cooperation to crisis management. Elena realized that she had achieved something remarkable: the ability to influence global economic and political outcomes through the design and implementation of institutional cooperation frameworks that appeared to serve everyone's interests while advancing her own vision for how international cooperation should function. Her success had positioned her for even greater opportunities, including potential leadership roles at major international institutions, advisory positions with important governments, or senior executive roles in the private sector. Elena understood that her next career move would largely determine the scope and nature of her future influence over global economic and political developments. As she considered her options, Elena remained focused on her fundamental objective: maximizing her ability to understand and influence the forces that shaped economic and political outcomes on a global scale. She had learned that true power came not from holding official authority within any single institution but from understanding and shaping the relationships between institutions that collectively governed international economic cooperation. Elena's journey from mid-level analyst to influential architect of international economic cooperation had demonstrated that sophisticated understanding of institutional dynamics, combined with patient relationship building and strategic thinking, could create opportunities for influence that extended far beyond traditional career paths. She had proven that individual agency and strategic vision could reshape institutional systems that affected the lives and opportunities of billions of people around the world. The success of Elena's approach to power and influence had established her as one of the most important figures in international economic cooperation, even though most people outside elite policy circles remained unaware of her existence or contributions. Elena had achieved exactly what she had set out to accomplish: the ability to shape major global developments while maintaining the independence and flexibility that allowed her to continue advancing her objectives across changing circumstances and institutional environments. Elena's story represented something unprecedented in the world of international affairs: the emergence of strategic influence as a distinct form of power that operated through understanding and shaping institutional relationships rather than through traditional forms of authority or control. Her success had demonstrated that the most effective forms of modern power were often invisible, operating through carefully designed systems and relationships that appeared natural and inevitable while serving specific strategic objectives. As Elena looked toward the future, she understood that her greatest achievements were still ahead of her. The institutional frameworks she had created were becoming permanent features of international economic cooperation, influencing decisions and outcomes that would affect global development for decades to come. Elena had succeeded in embedding her vision and strategic objectives within the institutional architecture of international economic cooperation itself.